Thank you, thank you. Thank you everyone, first of all, for showing up today for this very important discussion. So my name is Priscilla Platt. I'm a second year graduate student, an international student from Madagascar and France. And today I represent the Black Diplomacy Student Organization, BDSO. So first of all, BDSO is like brand new. For some of us, it might sound very new, which is normal, because following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery earlier this year, the Black Diplo students recognized the need to create a safe space and foster a stronger sense of community among ourselves. So, which led to the creation of BDSO, which is again the Black Diplomacy Student Organization. So that's one of the many beautiful things that came out of the work that the school's larger committee on diversity, equity, and inclusion has been doing and is committed to do moving forward. So our mission is to provide a safe space which I mentioned earlier, to the school's Black Diplo students of all grade levels. So it's not just graduate, it's also undergrad. And so we want to support them for networking opportunities, career development, and academic excellence. And also, which is very important, we want more community engagement, so we're working on that too. And for information, for the graduate and undergrad who are on the call, currently we're looking to fill in 2 more positions, so a treasurer and an undergrad chair. So feel free to contact us if you're interested in that. We would love to see your applications. So right now I will be introducing our guest speaker, Dr. Robbie Shilliam, and then he will kindly provide us with teachings and insights on matter, colonizing IR theory. And after that, our Vice President, Tamia Wallace, will be moderating the Q&A session. So to all of you who are on the call right now, if you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to put it in the chat or raise your hand during the Q&A session. So just a second. So with that being said, so today, Dr. Robbie Shilliam is our honorable speaker, and we're so glad that he's here. He currently is a professor in the Department of International Relations at Johns Hopkins University. He's currently researching the political and intellectual complicities of colonialism and race in the global order. So that says it all pretty much. But he's also a co-editor of the Roman and Littlefield book series. So he's working on so he's also a co-founder for the colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial working group of the British International Studies Association. And he's a long-standing active member of the Global Development section of the International Studies Association. So that definitely resumes the excitement that we are feeling today for having him, and we're very grateful. So I will right now hand it over to you, Dr. Robbie Shilliam, and thank you again for being here today.
Oh, well, thanks so much. Thanks to Priscilla, thanks to Tamia, thanks Dean Smith for the intro, and thanks Dean Halpin for helping to bring all this together, and to the BDSO, of course. It's a great initiative. I was just listening to some people, including Priscilla and Tamia, about why you set that up, and I'm really glad you set it up. So I'm going to do something today. We've all had a bit of a crazy and stressful couple of weeks with election stuff. We've had a crazy and stressful half a year with the BLM protests and uprisings, and then with the COVID stuff as well. And oftentimes, when you're in the middle of something, it's difficult to discern what the what the kind of tendencies and the forces at play are and how they might shape themselves out. And sometimes we just get lost either in the detail or in the angst. And so what I'm going to give you today is a story, and it's a story set ostensibly 5 years in the future. So I just want you to just come along with the story, and then after the story, we're going to have an awesome conversation. Is that all right? Well, it has to be all right because I've got the mic. So let's start. Imagine your whole life as just one straight line. You'd only ever be able to stick to one groove. Your wheels would jar and shudder if you tried to change course. Life would be unsurprising. You'd know where you'd end up from when you started. Your senses would be attuned to one direction. You'd develop a certain tunnel vision. The sides of your life would be a constant motion, a kind of static streak. All that Michelle Delaney knew of the elite college in Baltimore was a static streak. For years, her mother had driven up Charles Street past Johns Hopkins homeward campus to turn right at 39th Street towards Edna Gardens, a median income, owner-occupied and black Northeast neighborhood. Michelle's parents were socially aspirational, or at least they hoped to preserve and pass on their lower middle class status to their children. That's why they were committed to a college education for their eldest daughter, and a prestigious college at that. The best laid plans. It's funny how Michelle never imagined that there could be a campus behind Charles Street, which had green and idyllic depth. All she knew was the sign by the East Gate streaking past. Her mother's micro-directed timetable, full of purpose and contoured to the grid of the city, had paradoxically begun to unravel the family's painfully crafted master plan. If you can't even imagine the sight of your future, how could you ever inhabit it? Straight lines come from somewhere. Maleficent or careless designs of colonial rule that last an age, strict concerns for heredity and inheritance. Only my children race shall inherit the earth. Concretized boundaries that demarcate communities and separate the good and normal folk from bad and abnormal populations. Straight lines are fundamental to racial constellations. Consider the origins of the term race, la raza. 14th century meanings of this Romance word include a coarseness of fine cloth, a defect in poetic speech. Come late 15th century, with the reconquest of Iberia from the Muslim Moors and then the conquest of the Americas via the Canary Islands, la raza now predominantly referred to the branding of purebred, the breeding of purebred horses, and various religious lineages that made humans human. Jews, Muslims, and heathens had degraded or sinful lineages compared to the Spanish Catholic who had been born into a Catholic family, no conversion or diversion. Now, through purity of blood, the straight line was established as the basic cosmological feature of global order, 500 years long and counting. You had one irremovable route and you extended out from there. For the few whose route was virtuous and close to God, all for the better. For the rest, undoubtedly for the worst. The expectation of straight lines disciplined a motley humanity the world over. Michelle's mother sought to graft her daughter's life course onto a different branch of destiny. Education, she gambled, could bend straight lines, shift constellations. Fate came knocking one day in the form of a charity devoted to the public good. Michelle could never figure out what that term meant. Was it like a Sunday service, she once asked her mother, who assured her that at one time government had indeed administered to the public. Her father suggested she imagined praying to God for water and then asking the congregation to all pitch in with the utility bill. That was what government did when it was serving the public. Still, try as she might, Michelle couldn't comprehend doing any of those things without using transactional. And transactional was the app that she was on right now as she slouched in the living room trying to complete her college admission forms with a small AC humming desperately against the quiet outside heat. A year ago, Michelle's high school had received a visit from a charity that connected neighborhood schools to elite colleges. She'd put her name into a lottery and was selected for a campus tour of Hopkins. Michelle had jumped out of the charity's minibus, dizziness instantly hitting her because Charles Street should have been moving and she wasn't. At the checkpoint on the east entrance, endless scans micro-targeted her profile, costs paid for by the charity. Finally processed, she stepped past the side street into green depth and blue air and a differently dizzying sense of unguided, haphazard strolling alongside students only a year or two older than her, but a lifetime distant. Well, between Michelle and a future of 360-degree motion lay that app. Transactional was the most prominent of a suite of apps belonging to data management companies that in a short time span had been effectively delegated governance functions by most administrations in the G18. By the way, Brazil and South Africa were ejected from the G20 following their disastrous response to COVID-19, while the UK and US remained in the grouping of the world's richest economies due to the irreplaceable heritage of these countries within the fabric of the international community, as the Australian representative pontificated at the time. Of course, digital risk management was not a new thing to private business. But it was between 19 and 21 that apps such as Transactional had really come into their own as platforms for administering the risk that came with the provision of public goods. Now, in the era of COVID-25, public and private risk had effectively morphed into one. Some academics labeled this a shift from public administration / digital risk management to digital risk administration. Actually, it had begun at Hopkins itself with its COVID dashboard. An electrical engineer called Ajit Kumar used the freely available data from Hopkins to create a virus checker app called Symptomatic. Modeled on apps that reported crime levels in neighborhoods, Symptomatic initially assessed COVID cases at the street level, giving red or green indicators. One evening at dinner, Michelle's father pushed a YouTube video in front of her featuring an academic from Morgan State University. The prof proceeded to wax lyrical on digital redlining, declaring Symptomatic to be an apartheid app. Michelle had heard of apartheid in high school, but that was something very peculiar and particular to a country called South Africa, right? Baltimore's Roland Park Company created the neighborhood just up the road from Hopkins' Homewood campus. They were one of the first urban developers in the US to exclude Black peoples from owning property in their planned communities, and that practice came to be known as redlining. As the 20th century progressed, redlining took on different modalities. For instance, those who lived in predominantly Black neighborhoods were often denied civic and financial services on account of their zip code or made to pay over the odds. It was an open secret that the redlining of neighborhoods was homologous to apartheid rule in South Africa. Put another way, from 1948, apartheid rule formalized redlining. Around the time that Kumar was developing Symptomatic, Apple and Samsung updated their operating systems to include a non-optional COVID tracker that recorded the AGPS movements of the handset. This data was Bluetoothed to official government agencies on the assumption that movements would be anonymized and used only to build large-scale predictive models. However, beginning in those G18 states whose populist leaders had not only mishandled 19, but had simultaneously gutted any capacity for public health initiatives, AGPS data was progressively franchised to private interests and de-anonymized so long as a public health case could be ostensibly made. Symptomatic was one of those companies that made the shift from Hopkins to government data, and in doing so converted a public good into a function of assessing risk for predominantly private interests. In short, Symptomatic turned medical diagnosis into racialized risk management. No surprise in a way. The pharmaceutical industry had for some time used race as a category to determine biological differences in the testing of genetic drugs, despite the objection of many geneticists that genes were not races. Still, the descriptions and determinations held some kind of fidelity. It was just that their causes were not genetic, but cumulatively historical, social, economic, political, psychical, and spiritual. Across the G18 and no doubt beyond too, indigenous, black, Latino, Muslim, and other ostensibly non-white communities were variously but disproportionately affected by 19 to 25 along existing lines of comorbidity. The kind of jobs that, for example, black peoples predominantly held, when combined with the tasks that their bosses tended to give them, meant that they spent much of their day undertaking dysgenic and contaminative labor, even during pandemics. Essential workers might have been the front line. Still, there was a darker front line within the front line. The financial costs of illness and unemployment fell disproportionately on the front of the frontline peoples, which in turn depressed house prices in their areas and thus neighborhood desirability, and all that intensified the segregating tendencies that were already evident at the local and municipal level. When Michelle was 10, she remembered playing with a couple of white children down the road, but it was a long time now since even she, still in her youth, had seen anybody but black in Edna Gardens. Symptomatic intuitively short-circuited biology with race and space. Its algorithms scaled up street-level data so as to reference a vast array of zip codes, each becoming associated with one race, perhaps two non-white races, but never a mix of white and non-white races. Effectively, the app parsed the consequences of race segregation as the cause of racial difference and the numerator of risk. Practically, Symptomatic used AGPS data to determine where you spent the most amount of time, and that location provided your risk score for disease. Numbers range from 1 to 5, 1 being no risk at all, 5 being the highest risk. In all her days so far, Michelle had never seen a green number ping up on her family or her friend's phone. The red numbers started at 4. But Symptomatic also talked to other apps, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for digital risk administration. Now, while Symptomatic provided the score, the transactional app provided the indemnity to undertake a range of actions. Almost all contracts of association, whether to do with work, business, civics, culture, municipality, or religion, all of them ran through transactional. Associative activities took place in a locale, and transactional used Symptomatic to parse the difference between the COVID score of the locale where the contracted activity took place and the COVID score of the locale that the contracting individual predominantly spent time in. If the latter was a larger score than the former, then an indemnity was required to cover the cost of insuring against litigation for introducing disease into an area. The larger the difference between the two scores, the heftier the indemnity required to contract. Transactional was the brainchild of Rex Coetzee, a South African-born white man, naturalized as a Canadian citizen in his late teens. Coetzee had at college sculpted a utopic vision of a tech-full future for humanity that extended life. Coetzee's big innovation, he liked to believe, was the concept of a life drive. He ardently held to the claim that when it came to technological innovation, the means were not ethically important, only the ends mattered. The social, Coetzee argued, was constituted through creatively aggressive actions. And while the means of these actions might be violent or unsavory, the actions themselves cut through existing practical and ethical barriers to greatly extend systems of accumulation and production, thus prolonging human life. Transactional, Coetzee claimed, sought to extend lives by opening them up to any opportunity that might be said to mark an associational life moment, whether that be voting, employment, charity, church, healthcare, property acquisition, credit, or education. Now, it was entirely possible to register for a 19 to 25 blood test to accurately determine whether you were infected, yet the cost of that test had to be paid upfront, in full, and was simply prohibitive even to those aspirational families living in Edna Gardens. The only practical alternative was to pay the monthly insurance to indemnify against private litigation for spreading coronavirus outside of your zip code, and that was the sticking point. Frequenting a 1 or 2 COVID zip code for work, study, or in any other associational activity basically placed the indemnity option way beyond the means of Michelle's family and pretty much every other family she knew. True, Edna Gardens was not 5 territory, which came in about a mile south, and before COVID, the score for her neighborhood could be doable for contracting to a 1 or 2 COVID zip code, so long as the activity was one-off or extremely short-term. But the 4-year stint that came with an elite college degree and a 1 COVID zip code made a 4 COVID indemnity cost entirely unaffordable to Michelle's family. Activists and intellectuals regularly challenged Coetzee with a tranche of questions. Which lives were sufficiently counted as human so as to be prolonged? If some people's lives were shortened in the course of the extension of others, did it mean that they were insufficiently human? Wasn't this life energy driven by the pursuit of racialized genocide? Coetzee never provided a counter argument, but he did react unfailingly to the South African connection his critics often made. I am a Canadian citizen, Coetzee would bluster. Some people could, it seemed, convert their inheritance. Is there anything less Canadian than racism and genocide? Yeah, my family's here, so a bit of background noise is the rich tapestry of life. Nonetheless, it was an open secret. Everyone who felt the effect knew that transactional and symptomatic worked to render digital risk administration as an apartheid mode of governance. Everyday slang drew together the connections between wealth, location, and race. In hair salons and barbershops, 1 COVID was known as 1 white, 1 wealth. 4 COVID, 4 black, 4 sure. 5 COVID, black as red, attenuated before long to black ass. The root of pheno is to show or to present. Phenotype, to show or to present. And Larazza's global constellations always plotted both physical features and behaviors into straight lines. What objects one holds sacred, who one associates with and how one talks, what one wears, where one travels, eats and congregates are as much presentation as skin color or hair texture. Hence, 1 white, 1 wealth, and black ass. What those who felt it knew was that in the post-public era of digital risk administration, wealth equated to location, equated to race, all of which equated to almost free access to capital, opportunity, and influence. If you were 1 white, 1 wealth, then you made and remade your own heredity. You could circle. Hold on a minute, guys. I'm just going outside. You'll have to look in the bedroom. It's there. Look harder, man. Where was I? What those who felt it knew was that in the post-public era of digital risk administration, wealth equated to location, equated to race, all of which equated to almost free access to capital, opportunity, and influence. If you were 1 white, 1 wealth, you made and remade your own heredity. You could circle, zigzag, idle, and roam with pure freedom, even if you decided to slum it in a 5 COVID neighborhood for a protracted period of time, and even if you thrilled at the symptomatic color shift from green to red on your phone, you could simply pay the transactional indemnities and proceed as normal until the algorithm eventually returned you to your 1 COVID zip code. That kind of freedom was a world away from Michelle, but the campus idyll still called her. just 2 miles southwest, she had hatched a plan. It was the kind of plan that her father could not directly agree to, because to do so would be to acknowledge his digital incarceration and subservience to the apartheid app. It was the kind of plan that her mother had sanctioned, albeit through a recitation of Psalms 121. I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills from whence cometh my help. Joyce Moyle was one of an increasing diminishing. I can't help you, man. I'm doing a talk. You'll have to ask mummy. Can you shut the door again? It's been way worse, guys. I got a 6-month-old boy as well, and you haven't seen him yet, but you'll probably hear him soon. Anyway, Joyce Moyle was one of an increasingly diminishing group of international students who came to Hopkins on scholarship, in her case, from Zimbabwe. Like Michelle, Joyce belonged to one of the few remaining aspirational families, with parents who still believed that an education could set you apart and launch you into a future of low-density suburb living. Joyce had studied her way into the University of Zimbabwe, navigated around the boys, the strikes, the military incursions into campus, the emergency taxi drivers, and diminished library materials to win a place on Hopkins' English Literature graduate program. First, though, Joyce had to travel to Pretoria, South Africa, to conjure the magic visa from one of the 3 embassies left on the continent. There, she undertook a procedure that Symptomatic had made virtually obsolete in the US. Actual blood tests, 1, 2, 3 draws of blood covering all the black diseases that the United States Alien Control Services had listed on their protocols. Surprisingly, Joyce's blood confessed to no sin. On arrival at Dulles Airport, Virginia, Joyce was made to take the tests again in a side room to passport control. 36 hours of lying uncomfortably on the plastic chairs, and she was finally admitted to the country. Joyce met Michelle on her campus visit 1 year ago. Joyce had been asked to speak about international diversity, and she'd provided a stream of consciousness that was all at once a harder indictment of the US system than even Malcolm X would have given, and a diatribe about how American blacks don't seize the incredible opportunities that the country offers them. Michelle had not really recognized herself in any of Joyce's speech, but she was enamored by the speaker's confidence. They kept in casual touch via messaging. One day, the conversation talked. Joyce had had to send most of her stipend back to her folks in Kadoma. Kadoma, a farming town 2 hours drive from Harare, the capital of Zimbabwe. A 25 outbreak had just combined with a local resurgence of anthrax poisoning. The poison had been laid long ago by the Rhodesian army in rural farming areas. Remaining dormant beneath the soils, it pushed itself up every now and then as a colonial afterdeath. 25 plus anthrax had devastated both the local farms and the local markets in Kadoma. Joyce's parents and sisters and brothers were suffering. There was no choice, but that left her in deep financial trouble stateside. Michelle had always joked that neither security nor staff could really tell her and Joyce apart if it came down to it. All they needed to do was to harmonize their hairstyles. She had a point. Most of the security personnel who manned the Hopkins checkpoints were poorer whites and from the counties that surrounded the city. Not too long ago, cleaners, cooks, groundspeople, and security staff were all black Baltimoreans with perhaps a pinch of Latino. But then Symptomatic and Transactional came along. To be employed in a 1 COVID location like the Hopkins Homewood campus required a 3 COVID score at least, else the indemnity required made the wage worthless. Black security now secured only black property in black areas. And so 3 months prior to submitting her application, Michelle began to meet Joyce at the bus stop outside the Hopkins East entrance. Joyce would give Michelle her pass and she would slide through the checkpoint onto campus. See, it wasn't sufficient to give Joyce her phone to keep overnight. Symptomatic was a little cleverer than that. The app also recorded phone use and personal mobility over a period of 24 hours and aggregated that data into a pattern. Any unusual usage or movement would send a red flag with an automatic penalty that downgraded your COVID score by 1 point. And it wasn't possible to identify each and every one of your digital and somatic habits when many of them were hidden within repetition and muscle memory. That's why Michelle had to physically occupy the space that Joyce did on campus, while her co-conspirator shared with a graduate friend just across the road off campus. But the whole plan rested on a gambit. The insurrectionary information came from WhatsApp, from a few people around the neighborhood who had somehow managed to land a job, a deal, a scholarship that would definitely have required the out of reach 3 COVID. It went like this. Symptomatic averaged out a user's residency in weekly slots for efficiency's sake. Flags would be raised if the majority of your time was spent in a different metric neighborhood, and a grinding set of documents would have to be produced to prove that you had indeed moved up to a higher location. If those documents were not forthcoming, then a red flag and a point deduction came your way instead. However, the system would not flag if you spent a minority of each week in a different metric and racial neighborhood, and that time spent elsewhere could factor positively into your COVID score. Symptomatic could only be so clever. After all, app algorithms extended the straight line of race constellations, and that was the flaw in the system, namely the extreme rigidness of theory and application that made race thinkable and effective. Digital risk administration could not imagine that you might split time across different neighborhoods. Multiplicity of racial abode, just like circling, zigzagging, errantry, was not a mode of existence that poor neighborhood people were supposed to be able to access. The algorithm said no. $500 would be enough to live on, Joyce calculated, before the next stipend was due. Meanwhile, Michelle calculated that moonlighting in a one white, one wealth zip code 3 times a week, just under half of the weekdays, might bump her score into 3, opening the prospect for a just about affordable indemnity and possible entrance into the world that she currently only inhabited under camouflage. At least that was the gambit. In her quiet moments, Michelle conceded to herself that no one really knew. Just then, symptomatic flashed green. 3. Michelle's body shifted in the chair. She tapped the report button and the screen morphed back into transactional. Her eyes didn't really want to catch the whole vista at once. She saw a blur in the corner, which approximated a Hopkins logo. Tedros Makonnen stepped onto the speedboat at Port Andrach. Once the meeting would have taken place at the Radisson Blu in Addis Ababa, it had then moved to the UNDP office in New York after non-Africans refused to fly to the continent, and now it was to occur on board a super yacht. Palma, the capital city of Mallorca, had a world-standard marina, but Tedros's location was 45 minutes car ride to the southwest tip of the island, and now, he realised as he scanned the horizon of Port Andrach, it was naive of him to have thought that the yacht would be moored directly in the port's bay. Instead, the chartered speedboat took him around 3 headlands, eventually depositing him just off the coast of Sa Dragonera, an island off an island and uninhabited at that. That's how these people like to conduct their business, Tedros reflected, not only away from their stakeholders, but from humanity at large. Tedros worked for UNDP Africa's Regional Service Centre, specifically in the area of disaster risk management. Work was chaotic, no surprise. Parts of the African continent were experiencing a triple crisis of climate, COVID, and crops. Many African states were desperate for funding to build capacity in public health, as well as nationally and regionally coordinated food redistribution networks, but that money was no longer forthcoming. In some ways, Tedros and his fellow travelers had won the hardest battle, yet lost the war. All of them, apparatchiks of medium growth states of the global south that had become regional hubs, all of them were now firmly in command of the offices and the orientation of the UNDP, but just as they had won such a victory, G18 states had effectively recused themselves of any meaningful involvement in the formal institutions of global governance. As they empty-chaired, the funding dissipated. Currently, the UNDP was reduced to a bureaucratic statistics machine. There were no resources to redress problems, only to record them. The easiest way to explain the loss of this leverage was to compare two indicators that had over the last few years contended for influence in the halls of the UNDP. One, the Human Development Index, HDI, and the other, Overview. HDI was designed to counter the reduction of development to economic growth by flexing education and living standards into the equation, as well as by paying attention to various inequalities on a national level. Overview was a very different indicator, but it was one that the vicarious elites of the G18 countries used to determine which states they should bilaterally invest in. Overview was like an international version of symptomatic and transactional, all bundled into one. It had been developed by a nameless consortium of investment companies, drawing from the calculus of political risk that had long directed their investment strategies across the geopolitical terrain. Overview took the historical rates and numbers of infection in each country from UNDP data and scaled it according to GDP. The premise was that the richer the economy, the better it could deal with COVIDs. To arrive at its 1 to 5 score, Overview did not parse quality of growth nor distribution of wealth or illness as HDI did. And all this resulted in Overview providing a paradoxical set of evaluations. The societies that had been most destabilized by COVIDs, for example, the US and the UK, scored well in theory due to their GDP, while in practice they had consistently performed appallingly when it came to the human cost of pandemics. Whereas those that had succeeded in their public health measures despite their GDP, for example, Senegal, Botswana, they'd been burdened with an impossible to shake shithole, industry slang for a 5 COVID score. The higher the score, the higher the interest rates on any bilateral loans, and if one suffered a shithole, to receive any loan at all, one would have to put up a portfolio of natural resources as indemnity for political instability. The initial country scores that Overview generated after COVID-19 had remained the same right the way through to 25, and that didn't surprise Tedros. He knew that Overview's purpose was to act as a credentializing instrument by which financial capital and associated insurance industries could leverage what was left of the development project. In fact, Overview leveraged development at both the state and the individual level. You could download the Overview app and set up a citizen account so long as you resided in any country outside of the G18. And in this instance, Overview used the same UNDP database as HDI did to parse the worthiness of individuals seeking microcredits. The database aggregated COVID rates by reference to every country's equivalent measure of a zip code. Then the Overview app deployed the symptomatic algorithm to parse the data. Depending on the country, data could be regionally patchy and quite coarse, but this coarseness was no less so than Overview's evaluations of states. Actually, the domestic shifts within G18 countries towards digital risk administration were even more jarring when scaled up to the global level, where the idea of publics was already problematic. Public management, a quaint idea of the late 20th century, promoted the running of the state apparatus as if it were a business. Now, in most domestic jurisdictions, a billionaire class firmly occupied the seats of government. There was no longer an as if qualification to the commandment. Billionaires ran state apparatuses as direct extensions of their financial interests. The individuals might come and go and return, but the family interests remained. Government figures who interacted with international organizations did so purely to find the most lucrative investment opportunities for their portfolios. USAID, for instance, had become a giant fund manager for the family cabals that rotated through government offices with the help of Overview at both the state and citizen levels. Yes, thought Tedros, racism was now unmediated. Yes, ma'am. Did someone? Hey, Catherine. Oh, sorry, that was a mistake. Okay, I thought you wanted to say something. No problem. Racism was now a mediated, thought Tedros, a direct function of private interests that were naturalized as biological inheritance. Those who had the capacity to play the market were destined to inherit the earth. Yet here he was, a rare meeting to try and sell the idea of a global fund that would not be administered via apps and racialized disease vectors, a fund that equitably addressed basic need. The justification: even markets require external stabilizing measures from time to time. An old argument, it smelt old, but it was all he had. Tedros climbed the short ladder onto the latest super yacht built by the Chinese high-end luxury company Bucolic. The Effulgence, that was the name painted in silver on the gunwale, was the property of Carson Colin, current US Secretary of State and a member of the most prominent black billionaire family on the planet. Interestingly, each Colin generation was becoming lighter than the previous one. Colin had loaned out the yacht to a lower functionary of USAID who thrilled at the prospect and sent the bill to the UNDP. Of course, at the top of the boarding ladder, Tedros could see the red shawls of the testing station clapping in the breeze. He began the short climb. For humanity, he said to himself. From Harare, the Bulawayo Road starts out fat, then past Norton, it slims. Through 1-2 small towns, a burst of activity punctuating the quiet fields and occasional roadside maze or fruit cellar. Come Kadoma, you can carry on, transit area, or you can side off into the other side of town, the commercial sector. As soon as you turn, the asphalt gorges and riverines. Local politicians have for decades siphoned off any tax money. Ironically, their imported cars are too delicate and sophisticated to handle the local roads. A ways to go yet. After the commercial part of town, you turn right again. The Remuka Road starts fat too, but slims down quickly, past small houses that serve as kaleidoscopes of business. You name it, it can be repaired. Left past the police station and a quick right to arrive at the back of the township's shopping mall. The Remuka township suffered greatly from the combined anthrax and COVID outbreak a little while ago. That fact might surprise you, given the hum of low-grade activity, but look closer, and the skein of the social fabric has stretched further than anyone thought it could, almost transparent. Still, with every tightening comes opportunity for someone. She has a name, but it's not for you. She's been waiting patiently for the entire afternoon, just outside Mr. Mandara's store. He comes out with the last phone for the day. A woman called Joyce Moyle has just deposited it. Miss Moyle has been coming every day for the past week, but there's been no eye contact, just straight into the car and gone. It doesn't really matter. Recognition is hardly necessary or expected. Mr. Mandara holds the money and will not release her share until the next morning comes safe return. So she leaves in a slow pace with her bag of 5 phones. It's a long walk down roads with ever dwindling densities of houses until they finally morph into patchwork fields. Soon, partial brick walls litter the sides of a path, overgrown but reclaimed as homes by tarpaulin, or sometimes nothing at all, just naked chairs and a small gas stove with smoke marking habitation. A rusted sign says New Ngezi, but the following words, she's always thought they originally said Growth Point, but she can't be sure. They've been written over with liberated territory. She's pretty sure she knows who is the author of that palimpsest. With that thought, she starts to errantly navigate the partially formed maze of stunted walls. With random precision, she veers off track down a long, winding dust path over a bank and through a small piece of bush. Arriving at her destination within 3 hours, dusk is falling. The small clearing has its own kind of order. Sissy Vangu is tending to the imperfect rows of dark blue, black and green. Is that her real name? Probably not, but it's fitting. Sissy, sister, Vangu, Mai. She is a sister to everyone. The first night that she spent at Sissy Vangu's, she had asked why Sissy had planted the small black maize. Sissy Vangu explained that this variant was more drought resistant than the ubiquitous white maize, yet also yielded a higher calorific intake. The larger White variety had been grown on white farms during Rhodesian times, and many of these farms could afford irrigation systems while small-scale farmers could not. Why, Sissy Vangu had asked, is white millie meal a sign of good living when poor people would survive far better if they planted the black? Buddy Vangu is sitting in his favourite shaded spot. He's reading a battered copy of a book. They're always battered. This one is red with a purple stroke and a title top left, A Dying Colonialism. She remembers another book from her last visit, a thicker one. Ah yes, it's still there, top of the pile, entitled Black Reconstruction, written by a Frenchman, she guesses. She knows without any doubt that this erudite brother to everyone is the author of the new Ngezi palimpsest, because on more than one occasion over a meal of Sadza and Morero, he has explained the concept to her. When we fought roads, we carved out liberated territories so that we could live the right way without any shenanigans from the colonizing forces. We did so again when we fought our own apartheid under Smith, then when we fought the ZANU. We still do it now, and he would glint at her bag of phones, when we fight overview. Budivangu loves the flourish of a rhetorical argument well made. He tells it as if he has no idea that he's told it 100 times already. This, she knows, is the right moment to offer to them both the bond notes before they have to ask for their fee. Budi is right. It is a digitally liberated territory, or at least there are no phone masks anywhere nearby. If you bothered to think that the area needed surveillance, you might task a satellite. You'd never bother. So instead, the AGPS on all phones in the area reports a null. You stay for 8 or more hours out here and you don't get categorized. The algorithm waits. Now, just spend a few hours a day in a 3 COVID spot, in a car, on the street under a tree with some roasted maize, and yes, there are those areas around even before empires have been born. Do spirits move in a straight line, shadowing the living? Or do they freewheel above and around constricted souls? She is one of many phone runners, colloquially known as Mamobile Mamwea, the mobile spirits. They dwell in the nighttime places that the phone owners abject. Null is not nothing. Null is an uncalculable value. Soon Sissy Vangu takes her by the hand and she knows it's time to sleep. As they retreat into the low, warm light of the rondavel, Buddy Vangu starts to arrange his tarpaulin just at the circumference where the light falls on the ground outside. She prepares for bed. Silence and the monotony of routine strays her mind. Do they have children away in Harare or South or London or America, she asks. Sissy Vangu pauses. Yes, they do. And they work for Murungu. But she doesn't say where, and the word does not reveal. Murungu means white man, but it also means boss. The term fuses race, position, and power. A black Zimbabwean could be a Murungu just as much as a white American. To be a boss is to become white, and to be white is to be boss. Maybe, she offers, after they have saved the phone fees for a few months, they could join their children. And what then, Sissy Vangu returns the offer, value added. Work for Murungu too? Would that be your path? Or maybe you're saving to become a Murungu yourself? The words fall to the ground. No, I don't know, Sissy. I haven't thought about it that much. The lie hangs in the air. Starting afresh, with eyes trained on her own routine, Sissy Vangu explains. There are the black workers, there are the white workers, and then there are the Murungu. But for our part, we want to see the coming of the Lord. Thanks, guys. I'm moving inside because I'm freezing. I'm done, by the way.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shilliam, for that enthralling story. There's so much interwoven into it that I hope a lot of people picked up on. So we're going to go ahead and open the Q&A session. So as Priscilla said, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or raise your hand.
And comments, don't have to be just questions. Feel free, man.
How likely do you think this dystopia is?
I'm just trying to figure out who that was because I'm not good with Microsoft Teams. Who was just talking?
I'm sorry, this is Ben Goldfrank.
Hi, Ben. Well,
Hi.
what do you think, man?
No, a lot of it seems very, very close.
Yeah. I mean, I guess part of it is it's not really a story about 5 years in the future. It's basically like a lot of those kind of stories. It's really about identifying and kind of amplifying some of the tendencies in the present, just to get a better sense of them, if that makes sense. I'm kind of, it's kind of like Chinese horoscopes. I don't know if anybody's ever had their Chinese horoscope done, but those things are incredible, and they usually set up two contrasting positions, and then you've got to try and navigate between them. So like you're going to have a successful career, and then the other part of the Chinese horoscope is you're going to drown in a sea of drunkenness, something like that, right? So in some ways, that story is kind of trying to set out a set of kind of tendencies, and then maybe we can think about how we navigate them. How we try and avoid some, how we try and push for other parts, all that kind of stuff.
I see we have two people with their hands raised, so we're going to go to Priscilla Platt first, and then we're going to go to Maya afterward. So Priscilla, you can go ahead.
Hi again, and thank you. Thank you for this very insightful presentation. So my question is, as an African woman, and as narratives about decolonization are discussed, I often see Africa being, victimized as, being poor, helpless, powerless, and understanding the tragedy, but also recognizing the need to move beyond this narrative. What steps do we take as IR scholars to reshape this narrative? And because I believe that consistently pushing that victim approach is like more harmful than beneficial for us. And so within the spirit of Murungo, as you were saying, how do we take that power back and take unified action while still honoring and respecting the trauma and the struggle of colonization?
How would you do it, Priscilla?
So what I'm currently doing right now is I'm connecting with the members of diaspora here in the New York area. So I'm actually part of the African Diaspora Development Institute, and we are adopting a Pan-African vision in all our enterprises. So so far, I would say that, so when I say African diaspora, I also include, African Americans and Africans from Haiti and all Africans, Afro descendants. So what we're doing is that we try to not put aside our differences, but work with them, work on them, and never distance ourselves from like our local vision. Like we try just to like take all of those disparities as actual benefits and tools. I don't know if that answers your questions.
No, it does. And I also think there's a so I was in Brazil about a year ago, and it was the first time I've ever been to Brazil. So I went to Rio, and we were hanging out with a favela organization, right? Favela. It's kind of like the word for ghetto, but it's not ghetto. Favelas can be massive parts of the city, right? But they're kind of unplanned. They're not hooked up to the kind of formal electric grid and utilities and all that kind of stuff, right? So they're all informal kind of places, right? Now, one of the people was saying to us that so many people in Brazil see favelas as the problem, whereas actually the ways that people have to live in favelas, the way in which they have to creatively survive, might provide the rest of humanity with the tools they need to survive fascism, climate crisis, poverty, economic collapse, etc., right? And I think that's a very, very powerful thing. It's not about romanticizing people's lives. There's no romance about that. But it is about saying that actually, the people who are on the front line usually are the people who can at least provide the rest of us with some of the best insights into the problems and also some of the solutions, right? And to present them as either the problem or the victims is to actually entirely denude them of their human ability to think, to problem solve, to create, and to imagine, right? So I think that, to me, is one of the most fundamental challenges we have, especially if we're talking about the development industry, right? So even if you think about, like, the little bits I know about Zimbabwe, which I know are very similar in a lot of countries on the African continent, right? You do a lot of transactions through your phone, like money transactions through your phone, right? And that people in Zim, there's no currency, there's a bond note, but bond notes are scarce. So oftentimes it's literally money is scarce. So you do all your transactions through your phone. Now, when I got to the US 2.5 years ago, I was shocked that the bank gave me a massive wad of checks. Right? I was like, checks? That's 20th century. Now, like, my wife and I don't have a joint account, but the other day, I transferred some money to her account and then she was going to transfer it back. How did she transfer it back? She got on her app, right? But the app didn't transfer it. The app then told the bank to print a check, mail it to me through the mail for me to then pick up physically and then deposit that. And here I am thinking, in Zimbabwe, right, you just do all of this on the phone. And there aren't even any phone lines. The phone lines have all mainly collapsed, right? You've just got mobile telephony, right? So I think, Priscilla, you're onto the really important thing, that the places we see as problems usually hold the solutions, not just for themselves, but for humanity. And there is a politics and a power, and it's an insipid and a nasty power, which is about just consistently trying to say that these people are the problem or the victims, right? And when we do our international relations, how many times is it that that's how we find the narration of the African continent and poor people, right? Muslims,
Thank you.
Maya, you can go ahead and unmute with your question or comment.
Hello, and I just wanted to thank you for your time today.
Hey, Maya.
I have a bit more of a comment than a question. I was wondering, I'm more interested in the use of technology, the modern use of technology to oppress groups of people, right? So currently in the Xinjiang Autonomous Region in China, we're seeing the use of this app, the IJOP, to do very much the same thing as this app in your story described, right? With tracking locations and patterns, a lot of technological things that I don't necessarily understand. And I was wondering if like that kind of factors into the story that the technology already exists and is already being used.
Yeah. Can you guys hear my screaming daughter? Can you hear me over her? That's the question.
Yeah,
So
we can
carry on
hear you.
screaming. So as long as you can hear me over her, that's fine. So so in another life, I was one of the first people to do stuff in search engine promotion and search engine optimization back in the kind of mid 90s, and back then, this was even before when Google was just a kind of like a Google was nothing. There was a search engine called Alta Vista, which was the big one, right? But anyway, yeah, blah blah blah. Anyway, I remember back then everyone was like, this is the new, frontier. Oh, the internet is going to be this incredible, equalizing. Your toddler is excited. There's another of this. Oh man, toddlers unite. But anyway, and so there was all this, optimism, especially amongst kind of liberal economists, that the internet was going to create the perfect market. Everything was going to be leveled. Everything was going to be fair desserts. Whatever you put in was what you're going to put out. And of course, within a few years, it did. I mean, it did create a couple of new billionaires, and every now and then it does. But predominantly, the same forces which exist in the world at large are imbued within the technology that world creates. And it's as simple as that. So there's a person, which I don't know if you guys know of anyway, but if you don't, I would really have a look at her work. She's in Princeton, a sociologist, Rua Benjamin, and she's one of the leading sociologists on looking at how algorithms and technology reproduce the racism of the people that program them. And I don't mean the personal prejudice, I mean the structural racism. So that thing that I was talking about with regards to, the confusion of consequence with cause, right? Oh, poor areas, poor black people disproportionately live in poor areas which are disproportionately have health problems. Therefore, black people disproportionately have health problems, as if it's genetic. You get what I'm saying? So once you get those, once you mistake the consequences for the causes, and then you program that into your app and your algorithm, what you're simply doing but reproducing racist structures, right? Now, I think, Maya, your thing in China is I think it does. All right, man. I think it does play into broadly similar issues. It's different in some ways, but it's the same kind of universe, basically. Yeah.
I see Dr. Edwards has his hand raised, so we're going to go to him.
Thanks, Robbie. That was really fascinating. And if you ever need a side project in your infinite free time, I think you have a promising career writing dystopian science fiction.
Oh, don't say that, Martin. I just like Star Trek, but not
Yeah.
not Deep Space Nine, but the good optimistic Star Trek. Anyway, sorry, go on.
All right, but here's what I want to ask. I mean, if we sort of take, if we take your narrative, right, which is very cautionary about the future, when you look at the world today, obviously, if you sort of back that up, you look at the world today, there's obviously a whole lot of disconcerting trends. But when you look at scholarly practice, do you still see the same pessimism? Because you've been involved in this, in sort of a kind of a reawakening in some sense of conversations about race and IR in foreign policy. I was really struck by how many people were on the Bridging the Gap call earlier this year.
Yeah.
It's like, so when you look at the world just sort of as a scholar, is there a hopeful future for scholarly practice? Because we're now talking about race in ways that we haven't, or are we doomed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that that's differentially distributed across the academy, basically. So if I think about a book like Bob Vitalis's book, right, which in published in whenever it was 2015, what was it, White World Order, Black Power Politics, whatever it was, about, and in this book Bob basically details that the origins of IR as a field of study in the academy were entirely within imperial administration and race development, literally race development, right? And he has the receipts. He goes through all the archival work. He shows it's not an ideological piece of work. It's not rhetorical. It's actually very dull when you read it in a good way, because it's like this is what is from the archive. Right? IR was imperial administration and race development. Now, if we were scholars in the kind of impartial sense, then that book, Princeton University Press, not like a big publisher, that book should have already by now have changed the field. Those people who are making these pithy arguments about how the big thing in IR is the interwar debate between realists and idealists or whatever, would have had to have said, no, we got it wrong. The interwar debate, the origins of IR are not about realism or liberalism. They're about empire and self-determination, right? But has that happened? No. And in fact, the biggest, one of the big innovations in IR theory, and I know the people, I'm not dissing them, right, has been to say maybe there's hierarchy in IR, in international relations, not anarchy, not just anarchy. And I'm like, well, yeah, great. But what is the fundamental organizing unit of hierarchy in international relations from, not forever, but for a long time? It's empire, right? But people say hierarchy instead of empire. You can't have hierarchy without imperialism in international relations. It just does not make sense, right? So what I see is that the conceits of the discipline are more and more becoming exposed, and amongst certain scholars, and especially certain new generations of scholars, it's just untenable what they've been taught, and they're the ones who are kind of reaching out into new directions. The kind of the top elite anchors of the field, I think they have to defend themselves. They're not going to change. And of course, the other thing to say with that is that when we do this kind of work, we realize that actually these conversations about race, even which we're having today, have always been there in IR. They've always been there. It's just that, when people do their grad studies, they are told to read particular books and particular articles, and all the people who have been doing this race stuff are not amongst those. So it seems as if no one ever did it, but they have always been there, right? So I guess I'm realistic about it, Martin, that I think that, yes, it's true, and it would be incorrect to say that there isn't a movement on these issues. There absolutely is, and it's to the better, and it's exciting to me. And you guys setting up, your oh man, I always forget that acronym, BDSO. You're entirely part of that. You're absolutely part of that story. And the in quotes realism in me is like, and that is going to have to keep confronting, the elite spaces and anchors of the field, which, if they admitted what they had got wrong, they would basically put themselves out of a job, and no one would do that. So that I guess that's how I would say that, Martin. I don't know if you agree or if that makes sense.
I think it's a fair point. I think the other piece of this story that should be told is the reason why we're having these discussions.
Right.
This was not something that was top down. This was bottom up. Exactly. This was saying we need to have serious discussions. So what we are doing, what we will be doing, Hello.
Oh, jeez, man. I'm just trying to preempt the
and
next
bad.
screaming child, man.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Do what you gotta do. So anyway, so yeah, so I think
That's a really
that
good.
is what is exciting is
Excellent.
that this is about student agency, not necessarily about mine.
Absolutely. Yep. Yep.
Alondra, you can go ahead and unmute with your question or comment.
Hi, thank you so much for your story today. So I just wanted to ask, kind of piggying back off of Priscilla's point of how Africa and other continents or other nations, they are often victimized. And so I guess you kind of answered this in your previous response, but I was wondering, what can we do as students entering this field to change this perspective that we have of the world and of these countries? And also just going beyond academia, what can we do, let's say like at the policy level, or what can world leaders do to change this perspective that we have?
What's your intuition? You're muted, Alondra.
I would say that these countries would have to recognize that it's an issue and how they interact with other countries that don't have as high as GDPs as they do. Acknowledge the history of colonialism and imperialism in the world would be, I think, a start.
And your second part of it was about what you could do, you guys, as students or academics. So what do you think?
Well, I guess you did answer this. It would be having conversations like this, asking our peers and our professors to have more discussions like this, and also offering more race-based theory in our courses, not taking a perspective of just the US at the center and trying to have a perspective that involves the entire world, because this is international relations and we shouldn't just be centering these countries that are very well developed and that have been in power for so long in IR.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, and I think there's also, I mean, we were talking about this just before this talk, that there's a certainly the you know, like for example, if you're going to do anything on slavery, you better start and finish with Brazil. It second to Nigeria, it's the most populous black polity in the world, and not only that, it started slavery first, it finished it last. You know, there were Portuguese cities in on the African continent which were 500 years old, man. You know what I'm saying, right? You know, the idea of that there is a thing called a Yoruba nation was invented in Brazil, right? So the biggest slave port in the world is Rio, right? So the way before Haiti, in the 1600s, there was a quilombo, a kind of like, you know, enslaved people who kind of, you know, run off the plantations, run to the hills, set up with indigenous peoples and a few other kind of white nonconformists. You know, set up polities which one of them, Palmeiras, lasted 100 years. You might say, 100 years. That's longer than most of the states in the world today have been in existence. Let me tell you, right? So, so there's that, and then there is also the fact that if we take it down from the state level, right, then what we find is that the US itself has been part of a global network of movement, intellectuals, politics. Do you get what I mean? And it hasn't always been the epicenter either, right? So you know, there's a lot of African Americans who have been part of global projects. A lot of African and a lot of Black Americans have come from other parts and been part of it. You know, some of the people that we usually associate with African American history, you know, are from the Caribbean. You know, or have Caribbean links. Malcolm X, Audre Lorde, Marcus Garvey, Amy Ashwood Garvey, Stokely Carmichael. The list goes on, right? So Cedric Robinson wrote his famous massive book Black Marxism in a little village about 10 miles north of where I used to live in the UK. Yeah, and people think he's like a Californian dude, right? But do you get what I'm saying? So there is that to it as well. That in actual fact, what we can do is we can bring in the broader global constellation, which all this has always been part of, and at the same time, we can then revisit American history and American politics by reintegrating it into that global history. Do you get what I mean? And both of the things we can do at the same time. Yeah.
Thank you.
I actually have a question. So when we think about some of the themes and topics of your story, redlining, racial disparities in the healthcare industry, how race impacts economics, and as you said, we're told to read specific things in IR, but these things are issues that link, BIPOC, specifically Black people globally, making it kind of an international issue. Yet at times we've been told that these issues aren't international in nature, they're domestic. So how can we, as IR scholars and practitioners, change the narrative around this without unfairly placing the burden on Black students and Black practitioners to, educate people?
Yeah. How do you think?
I think step one is conversation. But I also think it's going to require non-BIPOC and non-Black students to actively want this in the field. But that's its own separate issue. I think there's a culture in the field of IR that values, almost praises the Eurocentric point of view. So there needs to be a cultural shift in the field as well, I think.
Yeah. And I think you put your I can't think my metaphors now. Anyway, you're right. There's a so first thing, the easy first thing is to say that the US is a settler colony, and it still is. You read the Constitution, it has treaties. There's treaties with native nations, right? So you can just start straight away from there. What people call the US is already actually international relations, right? So that would be the first thing, right? But the second thing is a much harder question. I'm more optimistic now than I ever was about that, and it's for a number of reasons. So I used to know a guy who was I used to live and work in New Zealand for about five years a while ago, right? And I used to know a guy there who was a Methodist priest. He a white New Zealander. He's old, but he as a young man who was just starting his kind of Methodist training and all of that. He'd gone as part of this university Christian movement thing to South Africa in the early 70s, right? And he'd gone in a kind of like a Christian thing, exchange or whatever. And he arrived in South Africa just at the moment where the South African university Christian movement, I think that's what it was called, was having to segregate along lines of apartheid, so that no longer was it allowed that you could have a Christian commune, an multiracial Christian commune in universities. You now had to go into your Black Christian commune, white Christian, Indian, colored, whatever, right? And of course this was a terrible moment for all the Christians there, because this was like, we're supposed to commune together, right? Jesus is supposed to unite us. Other things are not supposed to segregate us. So there was this, he was there at the moment in the meeting the last meeting where they could meet, as a multiracial group. And the meeting finished, and he was sitting there, and he just come in from New Zealand, so he was just totally paralyzed by the whole enormity of this thing. So this Black South African kind of took him under his arm, if you like, and took him for a walk and said, look, you know, what we want from you is not your pity. We don't want your guilt. We certainly don't want your guilt. What we want is your anger. We want your anger that even if this affects some people worse than others, it affects you. You can't live in good faith as a Christian under apartheid government. You are forced to live in bad faith. Now, you know, you should be angry about that, and then you're going to be invested in the struggle, because it's a struggle for your soul too. Right? Not that we're the same, he's saying, but that nonetheless, those are the stakes at play. You know, this is your soul too, which is at stake. So that guy was a guy, I don't know if you guys have ever heard about him, but he was a guy called Steve Biko. And if you don't know Steve Biko, just have a little Google for him, because he's probably one of the most famous anti-apartheid fighters and intellects in South Africa, second only probably to Nelson Mandela. So let's take that forward now, right? And what I see with a lot of white students, even privileged white students, even middle-class white students, is that most of them have some sense of foreboding that their life is not going to be as good as their parents' life. That you've got catastrophic climate change, that you've got indebtedness, right? Jobs are not good anymore, right? Yeah, and that's palpable. Now, again, who this hits and to what extent is extremely, uneven, and that is a given. But that it hits most people is the key. So when I see when I see young white people, in good faith trying to figure out how they connect to Black Lives Matter, I'm thinking, well, part of this is self-interest, not in a shitty way, sorry for French, not in a bad way, but actually, they know that that this is about their lives too, right? And I think that's the kind of sentiment that we need to not just grow as sentiment, but that we need to program into our pedagogies and our learnings, if that makes sense. There is disproportionateness, there is extreme unevenness, inequality. People are not, even now in my city where I live, Baltimore, who is it who is already getting screwed by climate change? It's poor Black communities, because in those communities in the city, there's no trees. So when it comes summer, the heat is way bigger in those parts of the city than in the more richer places where they got trees, right? Can people afford AC and the electric bill? Do you see what I mean? Where does the flooding happen? It happens in the poorest places, right? And topologically, rich people live in places which don't flood. So it's already all that. Don't get me wrong, that's there already. But I think there is a palpable sense now, even amongst white students, even privileged white students, middle-class white students, whatever, that this thing is affecting them too, right? And so then we go back to what we were talking about with Priscilla, right? Who is it? Which people, which traditions of practice and of thought are going to actually be most consequential and salient in us dealing with human crises, right? And what kind of obligations and accountabilities do the rest of the world have for those people now? You see what I'm saying? That's the kind of thing that I would say, Tamia, and it's not easy. It's not easy. I just think there is no, I mean, all of it, like a couple of years ago, I had a white Russian nationalist in my race and global politics course. He was quoting Breitbart everywhere. And so I know it's not easy, man. Trust me. But if people are coming in good faith, then we need to deal with them in good faith. If they're coming in bad faith, then you can just turn that off, right? But if they're coming in good faith, then there is something that we need to try and figure out with them. Not to put the burden on us necessarily, but that we have to live our humanity. We have no choice but to live our humanity with people who come in good faith. And that is a burden as well. But it's a burden that if you're a human, you're going to have to bear somewhat. And I get that that's difficult and complicated, and there's a lot of contention around that we can rightly talk about.
Thank you. We're going to take one last question from Patrick, and then we'll be turning it back over to Dean Smith for closing remarks.
Hi, I just want. Oh, can you hear me? Okay. Hi, I just wanted to continue off of what you were saying because, kind of for like the past 6 months, I've kind of been thinking about that. I've been watching, I've been reading biographies and watching all these things about, notable Black Americans like Angela Davis, MLK, Malcolm X. But more recently, I've been listening to artists like Nina Simone because I find that through an artist perspective like that, I can kind of understand something like a little bit more even the emotion that is behind that. And so I just wanted to ask or suggest, because coming into this semester, my friend Elisa and I, who I don't know if she's here right now, but we were thinking about doing this type of like coffee house thing where unfortunately the coffee shop is closed, but we were going to go maybe once a week or once every other week with a group of students who we knew were interested in learning about race like relations in IR. And unfortunately we weren't able to do that, but
yeah.
I wanted to kind of ask, how do you think there is a way for us to do that without necessarily being interpersonal with that? Because I thought the best way, seeing how a lot of the movements have come up, was being with people, meeting with people one-on-one, and having like a meal or doing something together where you're connecting with them. So how do you think to do that?
Yeah. I mean, I would just say one thing, Patrick, because I think it's a really good idea. And I think there's one principle to work with it, right? That that no one ever comes to these meetings without having done some work already. So that no one ever goes to a meeting and says to someone else, what shall we do? What shall I do? What can I do? Right? You can never say that. You have to come having done some work and with some ideas. And that is, it's to say, like, say me as a man going to a feminist group and then saying, oh, I'm a man, what can I do about it? How can I be a better man? And all that. And people would rightfully say to me, well, the first thing you can do is do some work. You know what I mean? Like, read some stuff. Have a think about it. Why are you saying, like, oh, you want us to give you the answer? Right? So I think that's the golden rule. I mean, there's lots of other stuff, but the fundamental principle is never turn up empty, never turn up without having done some work already. And that work will get you in trouble. But that is part of it. And it's good. It's part of it. Right? It's part of it is to get in trouble. Because how else are we going to do this stuff without getting in trouble? But if we're in good faith and if we can be learning iteratively, then we're cool.
Thank you.
Thank you again, Dr. Shilliam, for answering all of our questions. For
good trouble. Sorry, Tomia. Good trouble.
Getting good trouble. So we're going to turn it over to Dean Smith for closing remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Shilliam. This was wonderful. I spent my morning working on Seton Hall strategic plan stuff. We're, like many universities, doing some strategic planning. And one of the things I was pondering this morning is one of the learning objectives we have, and it's to support faculty efforts to redesign learning environments and develop innovative learning methods and activities that effectively prepare students for the demands of the 21st century. And while I was thinking about how you taught us this afternoon to use your story as a way to not only talk about the very troubling aspects of the current environment we're in, but how they could be so much worse. At times I'm like, am I listening to George Orwell? Am I listening to Ray Bradbury? Or am I, really thinking about international politics? And the reality is I was doing both. And it was a very innovative way to drive those themes home. And so I think that this is just a perfect example of not only did you help us, to better understand the issues we need to be thinking about, but you also gave us a very thoughtful way to do that thinking, to do that learning. So on behalf of all of us, I can't think of a better way to spend our Friday afternoon and to share the time with you and your family. This has been a wonderful experience for all of us. And on behalf of the School of Diplomacy, the Seton Hall community, all of our faculty, our students, our administrators, we are just very grateful that you spent the time with us this afternoon. You gave us a lot to think about tonight, this weekend, and for the rest of our, our careers and all the work that we'll be doing. We will need to show up. We'll need to get in some good trouble. We'll need to do the work, as you indicate, but we'll be doing it in a very thoughtful way, thanks to you.
Thank you so much, and it's been great talking to all you guys, and I'm loving the initiatives that you're doing. It's wonderful to see. All right then, I've got to go to a boring administration meeting now, so wish me luck. All right,
thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi, thank you so much, everyone. This is fantastic. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you guys for hosting this. This has been really awesome.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Nice job, central team, in planning all of this. I appreciate it being here with you.
Thank you, Reverend Bridget.
And I look forward to whatever collaboration that we'll be adding to our list as a result of this presentation today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for participating.
Okay.